And joining us now is Joseph Cirincione, who's a distinguished fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and a national security analyst and author with over 35 years of experience working in Washington, D.C. He's the author or editor of 7 books, including Nuclear Nightmares, Securing the World Before It Is Too Late, and Bomb Scare, The History and Future of Nuclear Weapons. He previously served as president of the Ploughshares Fund and director for nonproliferation at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, among other positions. He also worked for over 9 years on the professional staff of the Armed Services Committee and the Government Operations Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives. And he has a new report at the Quincy Institute, Achieving a Safer U.S. Nuclear Posture. Welcome to Background Briefing, Joe Cirincione.
Well, thank you very much, Ian. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us, Joe. And the one thing that the United States and Russia have in common is they're now at loggerheads or even brinksmanship over Ukraine and the possibility of a war breaking out. Some analysts say that, it could start, in a week or so when the Olympics in Beijing were over on the 20th and the exercise underway, joint exercise between Russia and Belarus, is over also on the 20th. So the one thing that these two adversaries have in common is they've got massive nuclear arsenals. Mm-hmm. And the last time Putin massed forces on the Ukraine border, then he mercifully backed down, he put the country on Russia on full nuclear alert. So this is a dimension of this struggle or this brinkmanship that's not really discussed very much. And I think it's at the heart of what we should be looking at, surely.
Well, I think you're right, Ian, both in the Ukraine crisis and in possible conflict over Taiwan. I think people underappreciate how quickly such a crisis could escalate to the nuclear level. In fact, there's a new article in Newsweek just this week talking about how over the last few years during the Trump administration, there was an successful effort to integrate nuclear weapons with conventional and cyber weapons to have this seamless escalatory ladder that could back up battlefields on a regional level with the threat of going nuclear. Now, the idea, of course, you can understand, is they want the adversary to know that the U.S. is prepared to keep going all the way and to have greater strength in their position, kind of like hoping your big brother backs you up in a schoolyard fight. The trouble is the other side has a big brother, too. And if you escalate, you're really starting to ratchet up the risk that the other side will escalate as well. So I am very worried about the conflict in Ukraine or a future conflict over Taiwan for exactly these reasons.
And is there a possibility that the chain of command in Russia, even though Putin has spent a lot of money on the military and made it much more professional apparently and better armed, nevertheless, there's a really alarming development where the chairman of the All-Russian Officers Assembly, retired General Colonel Leonid Ivashov, he published an appeal to the citizens of the Russian Federation, basically saying, well, I just quote for you, "We Russian officers demand that the President of the Russian Federation reject the criminal policy of provoking a war in which Russia would be alone against the united forces of the West." And he went on to say that Putin should retire. His organization have often, they're ultra-nationalists, but they've often demanded the ouster of Putin as corrupt and incompetent. So you have that senior generals thinking this whole possibility of going to war against Ukraine is crazy and it's going to turn the Ukrainians into hating Russia for generations. And then you get reports that there are some military officers that are concerned about, at the more lower level, majors and captains, etc., they're concerned about fighting against their brothers. So could you have a breakdown if they do go to war? And if you have a breakdown of the chain of command, whether it comes from the top or from the lower ranks of officers, how would that affect nuclear weapons?
Well, I think in two ways. And by the way, this kind of criticism criticism is very reminiscent of the criticism you heard from senior generals in the United States trying to warn George W. Bush about starting a war with Iraq. You remember senior Army officials telling Bush publicly that you were going to need tens of thousands of troops to do something like this, and it could result in a quagmire. Bush didn't listen, and I'm afraid Putin won't listen either. And in both cases, these are not some liberal bleeding hearts. These are hardline, conservative officers, both the United States and now in Russia, warning against this. There's two ways that you have to worry about. One is the dispersion of launch authority. We're not exactly clear what the launch authority is in Russia, but we actually believe it's more collective than it is in the United States. In the United States, the president alone can launch a nuclear weapon, and no one can countermand that order. In Russia, we believe that it's more of a collective decision involving the military approving of an order by Putin to launch, for example. But in a conflict, you could start to see, and we've seen this in some Russian exercises, and we've seen it in Russian doctrine, you could see the dispersal of so-called battlefield nuclear weapons, shorter range nuclear weapons, still quite large, many times larger than the bomb we used on Hiroshima, but just shorter range, could be dispersed as a threat, as a way to back up action, to signal that Russia was serious about this, and you, the United States, you, Ukraine, you, NATO, should back down. And in that situation, you really have to start giving tactical command of those weapons to the commanders in the field so they could launch them. So you might be worried about that kind of breakdown and a lower level officer triggering a nuclear war. The second is the pressure that builds on Putin. Suppose he does do this, and the initial invasion goes rather smoothly, like our initial invasion of Iraq did, but then he gets bogged down in a long, drawn-out conflict, and some of his forces start to suffer heavy casualties, and he seeks to have a quick end to this war, and he threatens to use nuclear weapons to do that, and then he's stuck in what theorists call the commitment trap. Once you start to threaten something like this, if you don't then use it, it undermines your position in future conflicts, and you can see the pressure build for the actual use. Those are the two scenarios I think experts are most worried about in a Ukraine conflict going nuclear.
And again, I'm speaking with Joseph Cirincione, who's a distinguished fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and a national security analyst and author with over 35 years of experience working in Washington, D.C. He's the author of and editor of 7 books, including Nuclear Nightmares, Securing the World Before It's Too Late, and Bomb Scare, The History and Future of Nuclear Weapons, and previously served as president of the Ploughshares Fund, a global security foundation, and director for nonproliferation at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and also worked for 9 years on the professional staff of the Armed Services Committee and the Government Operations Committee in the United States House of Representatives. And he has a new report at the Quincy Institute, Achieving a Safer U.S. Nuclear Posture. So I want to talk about your paper here, the Quincy Brief, Achieving a Safer U.S. Nuclear Posture. But just to finish up on the possibility of war in Ukraine and nuclear weapons being involved in that one way or the other, the U.S. does the U.S. have nuclear weapons, short-range nuclear weapons, in Romania and Poland?
No, it does not. It stores them. It has about 100 weapons left over from the time when we used to deploy thousands in NATO Europe, but those are in 5 U.S. bases in Turkey, Italy, Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands.
And they've been there for decades. So
yes.
Putin is lying then when he says that they're right up against our door.
Well, that's what he means. He means Western Europe. But no, they're not in Eastern Europe. And I think it would be highly unlikely that Joe Biden would order the forward deployment of tactical nuclear weapons. That would be enormously provocative and completely unnecessary.
So let's talk about your Quincy Brief, Achieving a Safer U.S. Nuclear Posture. There's an expectation, it'll be out soon, right? What is it? How often do presidents have to publish a new nuclear posture review?
An incoming president usually does this in their first year, and just their first year. They don't usually, if they have a second term, they don't usually issue a new one. So this is pretty much it for Biden.
And you point out that there is a history of the U.S. getting rid of nuclear weapons. We started out pointing out the enormous number of nuclear weapons that both the United States and Russia have today. the START talks began in 1991, cut the strategic nuclear arsenals in half, and then in the START 2 under President Bush Sr., they negotiated further cuts, eliminated 17,000 U.S. and Soviet nuclear weapons. This was done between Bush Sr. and Gorbachev. So we have a history. And of course, if you go back further, the global totals of nuclear weapons are down from a high of 66,000 nuclear weapons in 1986 to slightly more than 13,000 today. And 13,000 today is pretty, is massive overkill to begin with.
Right. Both the United States and Russia still have about 6,000 each. We have about 5,500. The Russians have about 6,400. Each has enough nuclear weapons to destroy all life on this planet.
So, but doesn't one U.S. Trident nuclear submarine almost have the ability to destroy not all life on this planet, but much of the planet?
Absolutely. We have 14 Trident subs. Each has 20 long-range intercontinental missiles. Each missile has between 5 and 8 hydrogen bombs on it. So, you do the math. Each sub is carrying over 200 warheads. So it's quite a large force, and one that all by itself could end life on this planet.
So do you expect Biden, in the height of this kind of standoff with Russia, to talk about or offer a substantial reduction? Because there is apparently a nuclear weapons lobby, and it's sort of almost like zombie politics. They just get money every year under the rubric of modernization. But it seems in part to be something of a boondoggle.
Yeah. Well, you remember the days, Ian, when these nuclear policy debates were epic, involving hundreds of experts and dozens of congressional hearings, and often accompanied by mass protests outside, or on the other side by organized conservative forces like the Committee on the Present Danger that warned in 1980 of a window of vulnerability where the Soviets might strike us first. These used to roll through Washington. You don't see that ideology anymore as being the prime factor in determining our nuclear posture. It's still there. And you have people like Tom Cotton saying it's costly and and difficult, but it's better to win an arms race than lose a war, and who see nuclear superiority as a tool for U.S. global superiority. The more nukes we have, the better, stronger we are, that kind of thinking. But that is relatively minor compared to two other factors that I talk about in the brief. And one is the politics of this. Most of the cuts that we've seen from nuclear weapons have been done by Republican presidents, Reagan, Bush Sr., even W. Bush cut the arsenal by 50% during his 8 years. Clinton and Obama, by contrast, have been very modest in their reductions and have been hammered for it. It's a big, tough political lift for them because Republicans come at them for being weak on defense. So they tend not to put too much political chips behind this. And you have Democratic members of the Congress who continue to see a vote to cut the Pentagon budget or to cut a particular weapon system as a campaign liability rather than an asset. But all that is still not the dominant driver of the U.S. nuclear posture. For that, you have to look at the money behind these weapons. We still think of these things as being, strategic assets for the United States. But you have to realize there's a half dozen companies who make billions of dollars making these weapons. For them, this is a product that they have to sell the way other corporations sold fossil fuels or tobacco or opioids, knowing that they were bad for the customer, but they would make money off of them, so they promote them. And that is the dominant force you have in Washington today, a consortium of arms corporations who spend tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars on lobbying each year, in campaign contributions to members of Congress overseeing these programs, who flood think tanks in Washington with grants to mute any criticism, much less criticism in Washington these days because of those grants, who flood the publications in Washington with big ads promoting the safety and security that their weapons provide, et cetera. And all that has come to dominate the process. And they really run the show in the Pentagon, both because there's been a revolving door for decades that's shuffled officials from top Pentagon posts to arms corporations and back, and because they've got a hammerlock on so many congressional districts, for example, where the bases are, where senators and members of Congress are making see nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons facilities as beneficial for their district and state, and are loath to give them up. And so this is compounded by the fact that this nuclear posture review is written not by the White House, but by the Pentagon. The Pentagon holds the pen with token involvement of other agencies. So in short, you've given the people with the most incentive to keep the programs going the ability to write the policy for these programs. And unfortunately, it looks like Biden is not going to overrule their recommendations, which are basically to adopt a Trump-light nuclear posture, to keep almost everything Trump did, make very few changes, and keep the contracts flowing, keep the money for a new generation of bombers, subs, missiles, and warheads flowing through the pipelines. That's the big disappointing thing about the Biden administration. He's not, the president himself is not going to put down his views of nuclear weapons, which are much more progressive than the posture review he's about to issue.
So just in the last minute then, Joseph Cirincione, could you make the case that we're actually worse off now than we were at the height of the Cold War, even though there's far fewer nuclear weapons, still enormous numbers? In effect, what you have is you don't have the physical disarmament, you have the psychological disarmament, where you don't have thousands of people in the street demonstrating against nuclear weapons and nuclear war, and you still have the weapons, but there's not this sense of urgency and alarm amongst the public.
One of the people I respect most in this area is former Secretary of Defense William Perry, and he says often that the risks of nuclear use are higher now than there were during the Cold War for some of the factors that you just mentioned, Ian. And I agree with him. And we came face to face with this in just the last few weeks of the Trump administration, when there was real fear that a deranged president would launch a nuclear weapon and nobody could stop him. Biden has the chance to change that, to make sure that we're never in that situation again. And the real tragedy of this nuclear posture review is that he's not going to do it.
Well, Joseph Cirincione, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with Joseph Cirincione, who's a distinguished fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and a national security analyst and author with over 35 years of experience working in Washington, D.C. He's the author or editor of 7 books, including Nuclear Nightmares, Securing the World Before It's Too Late, and Bomb Scare, The History and Future of Nuclear Weapons. He previously served as president of the Ploughshares Fund, a global security foundation, and as director for nonproliferation at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, among other positions. And he also worked for over 9 years on the professional staff of the Armed Services Committee and the Government Operations Committee in the U.S. House of Representatives. And he has a new report at the Quincy Institute, Achieving a Safer U.S. Nuclear